On June 18, 1982, a postal clerk walking across Blackfriars Bridge in London glanced over the railing and saw a man hanging from the scaffolding underneath. His feet were touching the water. In his pockets, police found nearly 5 kilograms of bricks, $15,000 in cash in 3 different currencies, and a passport under a false name. His real name was Roberto Calvi. He was the chairman of one of Italy's largest private banks. The press had another name for him, God's banker, because Calvi's biggest business partner was the Vatican. 10 days before he died, Calvi wrote a personal letter to the Pope. He warned that a catastrophe was coming, that it would, in his words, provoke a disaster of unimaginable proportions. He was right. Within days of his death, investigators uncovered a hole in his bank's accounts. $1.3 billion. Gone. This is the story of how that money vanished. Why a banker ended up under a London bridge with bricks in his pockets. And why, 40 years later, the trail still leads back to the smallest country on earth. To understand how Roberto Calvi died, you have to understand who he was working with. And that story starts in 1942. Europe is at war. Governments are collapsing. Borders are being redrawn by tanks. And inside a small walled city in the middle of Rome, Pope Pius XII quietly signs a document creating a new financial institution. Officially, it is called the Institute for the Works of Religion. Everyone else just calls it the Vatican Bank. On paper, its job is boring. Manage money for Catholic dioceses, religious orders, and charities around the world. But this bank has 3 properties no other bank on the planet has. It sits inside a sovereign country, so no foreign regulator can touch it. Its accounts are secret. No public client list, no published investments, no outside audits. And it moves money across borders under the protection of a state whose head is answerable to no government. For a legitimate charity, that is privacy. For anyone else, it is the perfect machine. By the 1970s, one man understood this better than anyone, and he was not a priest. Before Calvi, there was Michele Sindona, a Sicilian financier, brilliant and ruthless, who in the 1960s became the Vatican's favorite money manager. The man the church trusted to move its fortune into international markets. Sindona had another set of clients too. Prosecutors would later establish his links to Cosa Nostra, the Sicilian Mafia, and to a network of offshore shell companies stretching from Liechtenstein to the Bahamas. Remember Sindona. He comes back at the end of this story in a prison cell with a cup of coffee, because it was Sindona who introduced the Vatican to his protege, a quiet, careful, ambitious banker from Milan named Roberto Calvi. Calvi climbed fast. By 1975, he was chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, a century-old Catholic bank, so conservative it was nicknamed the Priest's Bank. Under Calvi, it stopped being boring. He built a web, holding companies in Luxembourg, shell companies in Panama, subsidiaries in Peru and Nicaragua. Money went in clean on one side of the world and came out untraceable on the other. And standing behind several of those Panamanian shells as an owner or backer, directly or indirectly, was the Vatican Bank. Its chief was an American Archbishop from Cicero, Illinois, a cigar-smoking former papal bodyguard, 6'3", who once said, "You can't run the church on Hail Marys." His name was Paul Marcinkus. Hold on to that name too, because when this empire collapses, Marcinkus will become something no archbishop has ever been before or since. a man who cannot leave the Vatican without being arrested. In March of 1981, Italian police were investigating Sindona when they raided an office near Arezzo in Tuscany. It belonged to a businessman named Licio Gelli. What they found in his files triggered the biggest political scandal in modern Italian history. A membership list, 962 names, cabinet ministers, the heads of all three Italian intelligence services, and at the center of it all, a shadowy figure, a man who hung from the scaffolding of a churchyard in London. His name was Roberto Calvi, and next to him, the question, who else was morally involved? Dozens of generals, judges, newspaper editors, the future Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi, all members of a secret Masonic lodge called Propaganda Due, P2. This was not a conspiracy theory, it was a filing cabinet. A parliamentary inquiry would later describe P2 as a shadow state, a hidden network operating inside Italy's institutions. And on that list of 962 names, one entry mattered for our story. Member number 0519, Roberto Calvi. 2 months after the raid, Calvi was arrested, convicted of illegally moving $27 million out of Italy. And then something strange happened. He was released on appeal and went straight back to running the bank. A convicted criminal publicly exposed as a member of a secret lodge, still chairman of one of Italy's largest banks, still doing business with the Vatican. But the machine was already coming apart. The debts hidden inside those Panamanian shell companies had grown too large to hide. And in the spring of 1982, the Bank of Italy started asking Banco Ambrosiano a very simple question. Where is the money? What happens next takes 10 days. June 5th, Calvi writes his letter to Pope John Paul II. He begs for help. He warns of catastrophe. He reminds the Vatican in writing that he has carried out operations on its behalf. The letter goes unanswered. June 10th, Calvi vanishes from Milan. He shaves his mustache. He travels on a fake passport under the name Gian Roberto Calvini. He is smuggled out of Italy through Venice and Austria and flown by private plane into London, where he hides in a small flat in Chelsea. Friends who spoke to him in those final days said the same thing. He was terrified. June 17th. In Milan, Banco Ambrosiano's board dissolves itself in emergency session. That same afternoon, Calvi's personal secretary, 55-year-old Graziella Caraccier, who had worked beside him for years, falls from a fourth-floor window at the bank's headquarters. She leaves behind a note, cursing Calvi for the damage he had done. Her death is ruled a suicide. June 18th, dawn, London. The postal clerk, the scaffolding, the bricks. Roberto Calvi is dead, hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge, his pockets weighted. $15,000 still on his body. Robbery clearly was not the motive. So what was? The first British inquest looked at the scene and ruled it a suicide, but almost nobody who examined the details believed it. Calvi was 62 years old, overweight, with vertigo. To hang himself there, he would have had to climb down scaffolding in the dark, over the River Thames, and load his own pockets with bricks. Bricks that, it turned out, matched the construction site nowhere near the bridge. His shoes showed no trace of the scaffolding's rust and paint. His family fought the verdict and won. A second inquest threw out the suicide ruling, and in the 1990s, forensic experts re-examined the body and concluded what many had suspected from the very first morning. Roberto Calvi did not climb under that bridge. Someone put him there. If you're into stories like this, subscribe. This channel is about what happens when enormous money moves in the dark. Now, who actually killed him? Start with the location. Blackfriars Bridge. Blackfriars. Members of P2 reportedly called themselves Frati Neri. The Blackfriars. Investigators and journalists have argued for decades about whether the bridge was chosen as a message. This is what happens to men who talk. No court has ever proven the symbolism, but consider who had motives: the Mafia. Prosecutors alleged that Cosa Nostra had been laundering money through Calvi's network and lost a fortune when the bank imploded. In the underworld, losing other people's money is not a survivable mistake. In 2005, 5 people, including a Mafia treasurer and Calvi's own bodyguard, were arrested, went on trial in Rome for his murder. All 5 were acquitted, not because the court ruled it a suicide, but for lack of proof of who did it. P2. Jelly's network had used Calvi's bank, and Calvi, facing prison, had become a man with secrets to sell, and the money man around the Vatican itself. Calvi's letter to the Pope had made one thing clear: if he went down, he would not go down quietly. 10 days later, he was silent forever. To this day, after multiple investigations, 2 inquests, and 1 murder trial, no one has ever been convicted of killing Roberto Calvi. But the bodies kept coming. In 1986, Michele Sindona, the man who started it all, was serving a life sentence for ordering a murder. He was held in a maximum security Italian prison in isolation under constant camera surveillance. One morning, he drank his coffee and collapsed. The coffee was laced with cyanide. 2 days later, he was dead. Inside one of the most secure prisons in Italy, no one was ever convicted of poisoning him. And some researchers reach even further back, to 1978, when Pope John Paul I, who according to several accounts intended to review the Vatican's finances, died suddenly, 33 days into his papacy. No autopsy was performed. The Vatican has always maintained he died of natural causes. There is no evidence otherwise. But in this story, you can understand why people ask. So what happened to the Vatican Bank? The hole in Banco Ambrosiano came to $1.3 billion. At the time, the largest bank failure in European history. The Vatican denied any legal responsibility. But in 1984, it did something institutions rarely do when they claim total innocence. It paid $244 million handed to Banco Ambrosiano's creditors, officially described not as an admission of guilt, but as recognition of moral involvement. Read that phrase again: moral involvement. $250 million worth. Then in 1987, Italian prosecutors went further. They issued an arrest warrant for Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, the head of the Vatican Bank, as an accessory to fraudulent bankruptcy. And here, the Vatican's greatest asset revealed itself one last time: sovereignty. Italian police cannot enter Vatican City. Italy's highest court ultimately ruled that Marcinkus was beyond its jurisdiction. So, for years, the head of the Vatican Bank lived as a man with a border he could not cross, free inside the walls, a wanted man everywhere beyond them. He was never tried. He kept his position until 1989, retired to Arizona, and died in 2006, taking whatever he knew with him. He gave almost no interviews, but one line of his survives: "I may be a lousy banker, but at least I'm not in jail." You might expect this story to end with reform, and officially it did. Under international pressure, the Vatican eventually opened its books to outside scrutiny. When Pope Francis arrived in 2013, Thousands of suspect accounts were closed. Oversight bodies were created. Auditors were brought in. And then, in 2021, something happened that had never happened in the modern history of the Church. A cardinal went on criminal trial inside the Vatican. Angelo Becciui, once one of the most powerful men in the Curia, was prosecuted over a disastrous €350 million London property deal made with church funds. In 2023, a Vatican court convicted him of embezzlement and sentenced him to 5.5 years. He denies wrongdoing and has appealed. 60 years after Sindona. 40 years after Calvi. Same walls, same money, new names. Roberto Calvi's murder remains officially unsolved. The files of several investigations remain sealed. Most of the people who knew what really moved through those Panamanian shell companies are dead. By age, by cyanide, by a window, by a bridge. Which brings us back to that morning on the Thames. The bricks in his pockets came from a site nowhere near Blackfriars. Someone carried them there. Someone planned it. Someone knew exactly what Roberto Calvi was about to say and made sure he never said it. The money was never fully traced. The killer was never maimed. But somewhere in a sealed file or a silent memory, someone still knows.